It says start. Hi everyone, this is Anatolian Entertainment. This is a total experiment to see if we can like demo in real time and save the demo. And I will be showing you Redux and Sagas and how to connect up with our APIs inside of front-end. It's an amazing inception there. Okay, so I will start this. We'll start with routes because this is where everything gets routed in. So I worked on the add new categories, and I created a new route called categories/new. And this with enhancers is basically pulling in auth and analytics for Pendo and authentication, which is passed down through to make any calls through the component if necessary. Then it takes in this category add container, which is loaded in up here from components category. So let's go to that one. So this container is responsible for grabbing the things from Redux and putting them into the view and, well, to the state, excuse me. And here we have this really cool thing called ducks. And instead of having, we used to have like 8 different files that we would put our types or actions that are in Sagas and like different pieces and parts to this strewn out throughout different files, but fortunately this kind of pulls it all together in one duck. So if we look at this, there's already a lot of types here for categories. There's created category, updated category, removed category. Not all of these are correctly wired up without like doing some checks and to like do some minor changes to say, okay, now our serializers from the backend APIs are using a key of results instead of categories, things like that. So we'll have to go re-add those back. But it's all set up here nicely. This is basically, these are the magic strings that kind of control what you see logged to the page, and you can see each action come through and see what the previous state was in all of your key value pairs and what the next action is. And when you first start up, you want to have an initial state for all these things before you like load them in through the API. So like for the data table, we have headers because those don't need to be loaded into the API. They're very static for the data tables here. Then we have selectors, which they're basically names for the HTML on the page that gets generated. Is that correct, or is that wrong?
That's wrong.
Okay. Will you explain it?
Sure. Selectors are just a function that will traverse your Redux store to obtain a certain prop or to perform a calculation. If they're simple selectors like these, then they're just going to be a nested path to somewhere in your Redux store where you're trying to extract an nested property. But if you, for the sake of performance, what we want to do is memwise our selector functions, and that's where selectors can be most handy. So if you have, for example, a calculated selector that's the result of like a few different fields that are mixed together, then memwising the function that selects it is going to perform significantly faster than a non-memwise selector. In the case of those 3 that are up there, they're not complex. They're just simple math to some nested spot on the Redux store, and that's what the initial state is doing. Is it's giving the Redux store a shape based on how we want to define it, but not the entire Redux store. We're just defining this little corner, this section of the Redux store that's governed by this this one duck.
Yeah, this one duck. Okay, and then just in case we actually like show this to other people outside of our company who don't know like what memoizing is, like what's a short definition of memoize?
Memoization is it's a concept that gets around in functional programming or even outside of it. It's just a way to be able to speed up execution of a function when you know that your function will behave the same way when you throw the same input into it, that it'll yield the same result. You can memorize that function so that instead of actually having to invoke the function, then you can just always return the same value that you got when you put that same input in. So you know that always passing in a parameter of 7 and then a value of or a mix of as the two parameters in your function. If that always yields a value of 9, then what you can do is you can memorize your function so that whenever those same values are passed in, you can just bypass executing that function and just always return value 9. Memoization is a way to speed up function execution, but it depends on your functions not having side effects and making sure that they are idempotent, that they always behave the same way given the same input. And so that's what function memoization is going to do.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense because when we first get category data, it's nested inside of categories normally. And so we have something that kind of gets that more in the top level of the keys that's more accessible for this stuff.
Yeah, and the vocabulary of using the word selectors, even though those are used to talk about like HTML selectors, in the vocabulary for this discussion, a selector is similar to a select statement from a database query, where you're naming different columns that you want to get back. So in this case, we're naming different properties that are nested deep in the Redux store. These are not memoized again because they're actually simple, but
yeah. Cool. So here's where the types come into play. This used to be in a types.js file, and we have find all categories, which is the action when it first loads up for populating all of the categories into the table. And what happens also is found all categories, which doesn't require a creator here. It's actually in the reducers. Basically, down here, found all categories gets the meta and the categories that's passed to it, and starts to create the key value structure for mapping it to the tables. So there's like page data, so you know whether you need to load more, things like that. And so yeah, there's like all these different types here, like for the search, which after we get GraphQL in that place where the header, I'm going to push up this change where the authorization is happening. This is another thing. It's like it looks almost identical to found all categories because it's kind of parsing the same structure of data. So that's just kind of a view into find all categories and how that works a little bit. Now, when we're doing a create category, it's going to take a category and or it's going to return a category from the create category, and we're going to have something like created category here, which this basically the spread operator copies or clones all of the state that is in the Redux store, and then merges that with anything that we add underneath it. So detail of category and categories is going to be added together here. And so whatever has changed, whatever the diff is, will be the categories here. So like if you had a view that had say got categories, which is normally the found all categories has that here, that will now be updated with the latest category added to it. So whenever you flip back to the table in our application, you would see the newly added category there. So now I didn't have a whole lot of time to adapt this to the ducks. I hope that it works properly. Because I was trying to figure out another issue this morning, but basically it's taking this create category action that was in the creator from this file ducks.js, and we have validators. So one of the validators that's in that file is basically we have this 3-letter prefix for a category, and so we want to make sure that when they type in 3 letters, it'll show up as 3 letters. And you can pass that to the API knowing that it's going to be the right format data. Map dispatch to props is basically putting this this function in there. And the Redux form is here. We're going to basically be putting in that validator, all the validators that are a part of this file, and the category add form. Which is, sorry, I guess it's, sorry, it's been a while since, I guess it's in a different spot. Oh, I guess I named it category add here. Anyway, so we have fields of name, prefix, and description, and we're basically passing all of this to the category add.js. So this is where we actually see like the divs show up on the page or get populated. I guess this is mapping this style to all the children of this form, and it's fancy syntax that's used in a lot of like SAS and stuff like that. But it's also copied. It's in styled components as well. So it makes it really easy for all of the form text boxes. They'll get the same thing. And here's where we get into the actual component. So there's the render function, which takes in the handle submit, which is native to React. It basically says, instead of taking an HTML post that normally happens, or sorry, HTTP post, it'll route to React instead. So that's something that when I was completely new to React, I didn't know that I needed to pass my function through this handle submit. And I struggled for a long time. So we're passing all the other properties in to this add form, style category add form. And there's a lot of repetition here. Name, prefix, description, and these values are populated by those props that are right here. And so these are the prop types. This, of course, it failed to compile. Also, for some of you who were late to the meeting, basically, there were a lot of things. I was trying to like create an example for you guys that was ready to go, but the thing is, there were some of the pieces of the API that were not functional that I was expecting to be functional. So that's why, like, I wasn't able to get this ready. I was like, okay, maybe I have to just use something that I've already done and try to make that work. So with the Redux. So sorry about that. Just one moment while I clean this up. So it's a debugging time. So validators.js, where are you? You are. Run the adjunct. Oh, okay. I thought I removed all of the node modules and cloud, but perhaps I haven't.
While you're debugging that, maybe give a little bit of background into how we're using sagas and
Yeah.
When you're working on a React application that's using Redux to manage all of the state in the application, you're subscribing to a different way of making changes based on user input. All that means is that we're trying to control the way that state gets updated so that it only happens through one prescribed mechanism. You have fewer side effects that way. And the way that it works in Redux is that we have this thing called a dispatcher. And what a dispatcher does in response to any user interactivity with your site, it's going to dispatch an object that has a field on it called type. And that type is going to have a string value in it. And you basically register all your types that you could possibly want to dispatch in your application. And that's what it was, she was showing in the Redux is a string listing of all the types. And what's going to happen is anytime an action gets dispatched by Redux, it's going to have a specific shape that's at bare minimum going to have a type field, but it also may have other data payload in there, including data that you retrieve from an API or data that you collected from a user form. It could be any type of data that you want to dispatch into that action, but it's all going to be a shaped object. And what you end up doing is you write these reducer functions that subscribe to different actions. And so if you have one action that is found all categories, then your response to that may be pull the payload out of there and put it in the Redux store. You may have another dispatch action that says find all categories. That's not a response to something that's requested of do something. So find all categories may be the response to that is now make an API call. And then in response to that, found all categories gets picked up by the reducer, and then you respond to it accordingly. And the reason why we use Redux Saga is it's a way to kind of funnel all of our asynchronous calls into one thread. So we're using multi-threading on the front end. So the main thread is where a lot of the user interactivity is processed. But then we have a watcher saga that's listening for different types of actions, a whitelist of ones that are going to tell it to go and get some data. And then we have a worker saga that will then go and retrieve that data. And whenever it's done, that worker saga is going to throw it back to the main thread. We're going to pick it up and put it into our Redux store. So that's a way to keep our application running really fast, is this combination of actions being dispatched to the main thread that are telling a worker saga in another thread to go and get data for us. That's what these sagas are wired up to do, is to help us funnel all of our data into that unidirectional flow that's part of how we write Redux applications.
You mentioned a watcher saga and a worker saga, or is that the same thing?
No, they're two different physical entities, but they're part of what constitutes Redux Saga. So it's basically just a function. It's a JavaScript generator function that will yield control over to another thread. In this case, it's similar to GFN greenlit stuff in Python or maybe other Python frameworks that might use generators. I don't know if Async.io does it, but similar design paradigm where you're just you're yielding control back to another thread, and it's able to then return a value back to the other thread. So that's because Redux Saga is Redux middleware, it has access to all the same tools that any other Redux function, any other Redux middleware will have. So that means that it can put something back into the main thread if you want to.
So I just wanted to go ahead and open up the terminal, or the console here, and kind of show what we're talking about with the find all categories and found all categories. So this is a namespace action, but part of the beauty of Redux is there's a namespace of ABC defined and the store called categories, and it automatically creates this this structure of putting the namespace slash the store slash the action, which is really helpful because we have things coming from Redux forms and other things in the application that have nothing to do with these changes in categories. So it kind of makes it so that you don't have anything running into each other when these asynchronous calls are happening, and you keep the stores pristine with only the information that they need. So, previous state for categories was no categories populated at all, and then the action shown is find all categories, which is shown here. And then the next state, which is super helpful for debugging, it'll show you, the categories are not populated there, but, it still won't have any of the categories yet because it hasn't found them yet. But right now we have 0 categories still. But this, after this completes and it gets the result back from the API, then it will call found all categories. And so now the previous state is still no categories. And now we have the action of found all categories. And then the new state has the categories populated, and there's 50 of them. So you can see all the IDs, some category counts, and that's what's being filtered into this data table at the end of the day. So that's awesome because we can keep subcategories completely separate. You see there's nothing populated for that yet until I go over there, which kind of cuts down on the performance loss as well. You don't want to get everything at the same time. So pretty cool. That's just some insight into what we're talking about with that. And then so adding a category, I'm hoping that this is the right prefix, like that isn't already populated in the database, because when we delete categories currently, it doesn't actually delete them. So I'm hoping that this will work. We have our validator here. It says it must be 3 characters. So that's showing there. I guess the validators, they're not actually shown in here because they're not actions, but that's kind of a preview of that. And then we add, so we can see, it's really cool because we can see the action from the Redux form, and we can see the actions that we have generated. So creating a category, we'll see if this actually worked. And if not, I'm going to have to look at it. We're not going to have any categories yet until we have created a category that has a user. So next state, categories should have, I guess it's undefined, or it has an array of 1. That's weird. But we'll see if it actually showed up in our categories. So I'll have some, just a second, I have to authenticate. So get a token, and we'll put that into Postman. This is OAuth. We have to go get a token, and it expires every hour. So let's see. Yeah, so actually that added the something now. So that's pretty cool. It's making a call out to the API, and now I can kind of show you guys how that works. So we've shown how we get things from the API. Let's show how we put things in the API. So if we go back and close this, because I added this back in, I'm not sure how that package didn't show up. This is an old error. Okay. So we have the name, prefix, and description as fields, and back in this container we have this category add form, and then we have the create category action that's pulled from Dux. Remember, so the reducers are all like basically taking data that's coming into the application and storing them in the state. But the creators are, the reason that these are called creators is like, okay, now we're going out and we're making calls. So or maybe that's wrong actually. Oh yeah, there's a create category. Maybe this is unnecessary. I don't know. What happens if I delete that? I'm curious. Well, we have found category. So this is actually just defining all the types then. Inferring, I'm making up things. Okay, so create category and create a category. Let's find where those API calls are made. Sagas, thank you. For some reason, I thought that was going to be imported, but I guess not. We have RESTful ones and we have GraphQL ones, which we'll cover in a different demo. So we have create category, and all these other ones, find category, find all categories. And so we define the Saga here, which is a generator function. That's the thing that gets called that, and we are passing in the service, which is used to be an Axios service, now it's API sauce, because we can pass in our authorization and do it every time, basically, update that.
Can you go, sorry, this is one of the, where does this create category Saga, where does it get called?
It's in RESTful.js. It used to be called Saga.js because now we have multiple. So it's inside of categories since we're in there. It's in its own like folder inside of the components categories folder. So like if we're gonna make sagas for subcategories, we also have a sagas GraphQL RESTful.
So is that actually calling the create category Saga function, that function right there? They actually create category. Basically, where does that function get called and where does the service get passed in?
Yeah, in two spots. So,
this actually was the part that I was confused about when I was trying to answer my own.
in a Sagas file like this, because these Saga functions are so tiny, we'll just combine the worker and watcher Sagas in the same file. Anything that's being exported is a watcher Saga. So you'll see these effect creator functions that are built into Redux Saga, like take latest, take every, that will respond to something that's dispatched in the main thread. In this case, whenever the main thread dispatches or basically a request to create a category or to update a category or find all categories is another one down there, it will respond to it by invoking a worker Saga. And so what it's doing here, for example, is anytime the main thread invokes, dispatches a remove category, it's going to respond by applying the call remove category Saga, which is this one. So this gets applied in response to every time the watcher Saga listens and hears this one being dispatched. But these are all wired up, right? And
Yeah,
there we go. These are all wired up here. So this is where all of the sagas from all the sub-component folders are imported, and they're all wired together. They're passed in the API instances that we created in the store.js. And so that's what allows them to have access to that type of dependency deep in the Saga.
What's the asterisk services?
It's JavaScript syntax for a generator function. So if you put that on a function when you create it, and it doesn't work for anonymous fat arrow functions, you have to actually use that keyword. But if you put an asterisk after it like that, then that means that you can use the yield keyword inside that function.
Okay. Wait, where do you see that? Oh, the function asterisk, okay.
Yeah, so that allows us to use yields and make sure that this has to complete before this completes. And normally, like without that, JavaScript calls can be called in any like in any order. So
Never replace it async away, right?
But yeah, it's very similar.
Similar,
basically, yeah, but it behaves identically in these sagas.
So, and the action is passed in every time, actually, but it's because we actually wanted to pull something off of the action in this particular case, like the category detail, which will eventually, I'll be putting that back on the screen. I haven't had time yet because we've been working on authentication stuff. But basically, we'll be able to display that out back to the screen, and without having to go into the store, at the time of this create category, it'll actually we'll be able to just put that into the view right away. And I mean, we could put it into the store as well, but it's really, once you kind of get this flow, it actually becomes a lot faster over time. Instead of having like, it may seem like it's a lot of steps for, like, I understand as being like a backend developer before this point, like I'm like, is there so many different layers at first? But actually with the ducks and having it in one file, it's cleaned it up so I don't have to go hunting through a lot more files to get to this point. So the more that you do it, the easier it gets. And so let's just talk about the application itself. So how it's getting all of these. This is one section. So we have categories and we have subcategories. Eventually we're going to have catalog that has products in it. The sagas, we've shown this part, but so app.js, no, sorry, where does store get invoked? Sorry, how does store.js like
It's imported in routes.js.
Routes, that's okay. Okay, there we go. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. So yes, from store. Here we go. Yeah, and so this actually allows it to be a store provider for all of these things, since it's wrapped around all the routes and their containers. They get the store. And so when store gets instantiated here, we have the category service, we have user service, which will basically be organizations. To show off the authentication, basically, there's this Saga middleware, or Redux middleware, excuse me. There's Saga middleware here, which is actually getting the category service passed in through all of those, and that's how that's actually getting the service through all of those calls. Like the service has the base URL, and eventually gets the token as well. And so then we also have this middleware that actually takes in a service and applies the auth token. And this is going to be refactored soon to be more publicly available for the Titanium web components as well. That's more open source, thanks to Tim's merge request. And so that's like how it all filters in. And so that comes from sagas, and this is grafted together from all of those individual folders. Are there some more questions that people have?
Sure.
Does that make sense, or is there anything else we want to go over in more depth?
I guess, yeah. So imagine you just have a resource that you're trying to list. What's you're developing, the page doesn't exist yet. Can you kind of just, I know you kind of did it in general across everything, but first step,
Yeah.
Create a resource, I want to list it on the page. What's the first step I have to do? Router, yes.
Yeah. So in routes, we want to create a container.
there's a little bit of magic that's happening with those enhancer decorators, but any higher order component can be chained together and wrapped around the component that you actually want to route to. So if you have a requirement that a certain route be an authenticated route, then you would apply that as a decorator for a higher order component. Same type of technology though. So any of those routes on there that have a with authentication enhancer, that's basically just kind of this sandwich of several different higher order components that are making sure that you actually have a token and that your token's valid. But you can apply as many or no decorators if you want to be a public route.
So I just created a catalog container.js so I can reference it here. I'm sure that this is already, well, I guess, no, you've been working on a new product, right? Components. Sorry.
I think in answer to your first question, as far as like where do you start, my first question would just be, if the component that I'm going to be working on has a specific data needs that make it different than the other components that I have, that I might need to actually carve out a different shape in the Redux store and kind of like create a separate folder for it. But if it's something that can blend into,
I'm trying to figure out that. Basically, what I'm trying to understand is like I created an API. I want to see what I want to get the data on the page as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
What is the minimum amount basically from beginning? Like I have this API endpoint that I created. I'm a backend developer. I'm working. I'm like, oh, hey, let me start to like get this on the page.
Let me see the JSON.
Let's just see it. What like I need a router to have a URL to route to. I need to create a container.
Fetch your data from Redux and apply it to the view.
Yeah. And then I need to put, I'm assuming I need to put something in RESTful and the RESTful.js, the service, to actually make the call.
Yeah. So you're so in this case, because we're using Redux Saga, you would make your call to your API from inside of your Saga.
Yeah.
And it would also probably be a good idea to create a couple of actions, one that tells it to go and get that data, and the other one that responds back after it has that data. And the one that's the response action is the one that you're going to put into your reducer to actually take that data payload and put it into your store. So it would be the number of files you would edit would be one Saga. You would edit or create a doc to put in all your types, your action creators, your selectors, and your reducers. All that Redux boilerplate would be thrown into that doc file. And then you would alter your routes.js to include your route. You can create a container around your components view to actually go and fetch the data from the Redux store and apply each one of your properties into your view. And then you would actually create your view, which is just a React component. So it would be an actual React component, a container component, a Saga, a doc to wire up all your Redux boilerplate, and then you would put that into your routes.js, so about 5 files you'd be messing with.
Yeah, even branding components, the users is that's one I just worked on. It's just got API docs, index, Saga, user accounts container, and then user accounts.js.
You want to show it? Yeah.
I think you have it open, right? Branding components? Yes, you have branding components.
Yeah, but I don't know if it has your latest stuff in it, does it?
Oh, I just changed URLs. I mean, I didn't really. I was just saying that that's a pretty simple component, I think, because it only has the sagas. It doesn't for RESTful. So
Oh,
it has
yeah.
like sagas.js instead of RESTful GraphQL.
Yeah. So users.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sagas. Yeah. This is what it used to look like when we didn't have a GraphQL thing in there. So it was just sagas.js. But yeah. So this is the thing that actually goes and gets the data, and then you would have something that would be the worker response for that, and that the worker responses are the ones that are don't have exports basically, and the ones that have exports are basically okay. We're going to use this it's being called from some other place in the application, right? So this is what initiates the flow. So anything that has an export on it. So find all, find user, found user, things like that.
Yeah, that's not a requirement of Redux Saga to name your types in any specific way. That's just more of a convention that if your main thread is driving the logic to go and get your data, that you end up just creating a lot of pairs of action types. One that'll tell the watcher to go and apply the worker saga, and then the one the worker saga applies back in response to it. So that's just more of a convention. It's not a requirement of using those.
Sorry, here's the service information. So like from your standpoint of like, okay, we're doing the gets. There's an API.js that basically spells out the URLs that you're. Oh my gosh, Linguist's pronunciation of URL is infiltrated me. URLs.
Well, I mean, I think it goes like you define your APIs, your ducks use your APIs, sagas use the ducks.
Yeah.
And then that is all wired in your, well, they're aggregated in the sagas for the entire app, and that's used in your store.
Yeah. Say that all again, because I was thinking.
Yeah.
You define your API calls. That's the API.js. If you go back to the user's really easy to follow because I think it's got the minimal number of files in there.
API.js, that for like kind of components.
Right, so that's where you're doing like service.get and then some endpoint, right? Your RESTful endpoint. And then your ducks use your APIs. Is that right?
Yeah.
Through your, lost my train of thought there. Let's see where.
Yeah, that API is.
Sorry,
it's also a convention. I mean, it's what we used to do in Angular a lot as well, where you create an instantiated API client. That's really what that API is. It's just a front end client to go and talk to your API.
Yeah.
And your sagas use your API.
Yeah.
Wait, I thought you said the ducks use your
I did, and that was incorrect.
Oh, okay. Okay, sagas use the API.
Ducks use the sagas.
Sagas use the ducks.
The sagas are wired in as Redux middleware.
Yeah.
So they listen to all the dispatched actions, but they just have a certain thing that they do that's different. Where the watcher is going to listen to certain whitelisted ones that you've gone and registered, and then it will apply worker sagas in response to those.
So your sagas use your ducks, and then the ducks are all aggregated. I mean, the sagas are all aggregated in the app sagas, and the store uses your entire sagas.
Yeah, there's obviously different ways of handling dispatch Redux action. Like you, Glenn, I've got my teeth on Redux Funk for a while before I even heard of Redux Saga.
Here's what I just as somebody that doesn't know because I haven't used them.
Yeah.
My question, you know me pretty well, I know. My question is what does this extra, because this is an extra layer of complexity for sure, right? What do you gain from it?
A couple things. The one that you'll hear thrown around is like propaganda most of the time is it keeps your action creators pure. That's something that was unavoidable with Redux is that when you go to apply a dispatch Redux action in your container component, it's not always clear whether or not the action that you're then injecting into your component is a thump that actually has like a callback in there that has to then take the payload and then apply it, or whether or not that's actually just a pure action creator that is only returning an object with a type field on it. And so that was, I do remember that was one of the things that was the most tricky and challenging as the application scaled out with Redux Stunk, is that there would be some times where I would realize, why is nothing happening here? Oh, that's right, because I have to invoke the result of invoking that first function because I forgot this is a func. And so at least with not just Redux Saga, but with Redux Observable, a few other newer implementations of this, they're trying to like eliminate that that headache of making sure that every time you have an action creator function that that it's an easy function signature. It's just you invoke it and it returns an object with a type field on it. So for debugging, that can be a little bit easier. The other thing that can be a benefit to this is that you can reap some performance improvements by just dealing with like multiple threads in front end of the browser, and the fact that like we have Redux middleware that applies these in a separate thread can lead to some performance improvement. But in addition to that, I guess I would say that like I feel like I write less code when I'm putting sagas together, and I think that's partly because they've gone and created so many effect creator functions like take every input, call, fork.
Those are part of sagas themselves.
Yeah.
So we do integrating that.
Yeah. And so it can come out like when you're looking at an entire file of sagas, it can be a little bit more human readable, where you can see anytime you see a call, for example, that you're taking your API client and then you're making a call with it, and then you're yielding the result and then like putting it back into the main thread. So when you'll see call and put used together in a Saga a lot, and all that put does is it dispatches the Redux action back to the main thread. So it's maybe a little bit.
So with thumps, you would just dispatch the way you do it.
It depends
Well,
on whether or not there's an
you would get a lot
there or not.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. So like, but I'm trying to relate this, trying to figure out so my mind can actually. in a thunk, you would call some
You dispatch an action,
whatever. You would have access to the dispatch event, and then you would pass in the result of that.
Yeah.
With another action. And just shit like you just.
Yeah. And that's another thing too, is that the code I would write container components with Redux Stunk tend to be a little bit more verbose, because there'd be a lot of times where I would have to override the default behavior of map dispatch to props, because I needed to actually pass the dispatcher into my function, so that after the asynchronous call was done, then I could invoke dispatch for a response action. So that there were a lot of those types of actions that I had to map in container components, where the only thing I needed to do was just pass the dispatcher in, so that I could have it when I needed it later. I mean, the same technology is happening with Redux Saga, and the same thing would be happening with Redux Observable too, if we went that route. The only thing that's different is that they just sort of like funneled it all into one specific opinionated way of doing it, and that's the main thing that's different about it, is that it's just it's a little bit more predictable. It does cut down on the code you write in your containers, and it is abstracting away a lot of just the setup of each dispatch function, so that you don't have to do that each time. But I mean, the positive that I would say about sagas over maybe something like Redux Observable is that when you're dealing with observable collections, or that way of handling Redux middleware, is that it's not always obvious what is happening, or what's actually causing the action to get invoked, or it's not always obvious, like when you have certain like sockets open, and whether you're long polling and whether you're just waiting around for something to respond back. And
so it isolates all of that.
Yeah, Sagas is a little bit more
resilient.
Sagas is a little more where you're specifically carving out the shape of what you want your application to do, and you can maybe reason a little bit more about it. But I mean, observable collections are this big thing in the Knockout.js and Meteor.js community, and so that's one reason why Redux Observable is a very strong candidate that's out there, and MobX also.
MobX completely replaces Redux.
Oh, yeah, there's several different, not competitors to Redux, but they're just different flavors of it. Some of them that, like for smaller applications with much smaller state needs, then you don't need to go with something like Redux. You can go with Redux 0, which is a zero configuration, unidirectional flow of data. But there's several things that are out there. And, part of it is just there's always going to be like a different, differences philosophically between people that want observable, reactive ways of interacting with data and ones that want more designed, reactive ways of dealing with data on the front end. But they don't mix though.
Yeah.
Choose
You
one.
wouldn't have both.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to show is so take this category search item added action that it's basically there's a handler inside of the search bar that whenever there's a pill added to this, it will start creating creating the action of category search item added. This actually calls another Saga to do a search in the API.
Wait, does
Through
that call
Redux
Saga?
Saga. This calls a Saga, yes. But the reason that this is so helpful because
Sort of, failed
Yeah,
out there.
it
Not
failed.
trying to catch you.
but so what I wanted to say is each of these things that would have happened, it's all been canceled. Like anything that would be rendered. It's really nice because I can actually see what's going on exactly. Like if there was, say, for these huge product, beautiful UI UX things, if we're pulling a lot of data, product's different because it has most of the thing right in the same model or the same view set. But what if we're creating something that has multiple APIs and is grafting together from very many sources? If something relies on one of those APIs to render something else, maybe, I don't know, so a drop down for the subcategories that are related to those categories or something like that. Well, so that's 2 API calls, right? Where do I find exactly where things are going wrong? Easily, fast. This is how, because I would know that we haven't gotten there yet, but we'll basically be doing a yield put a yield call to call the API for the category itself to get the details. And then we're going to assign it to one of these drop downs of the subcategories. We're going to have a yield put to assign it to that category, but we're also going to have a yield call for grabbing the subcategories that you can assign it to. And now if they're already in the store, you don't have to go and make those calls necessarily. That's another thing is you're really managing your state well, and they're in different namespaces as well. So you know exactly what you have so far, right? So you're gonna actually be able to see all of the different calls you're making and whether they failed or succeeded. So what if there's a problem in subcategories and you have to go figure that out? You actually see it all right here, exactly what those errors are. And we can have those error boundaries as well within the components to give more information. But it's really handy because you can basically see a cascade effect of what's happening. So that's just what I wanted to show. And you can see where this is being called inside of the sagas. So the action of, where did it go? Oh, it's in GraphQL. So search categories is the worker that comes back, and then there's a reducer that's in Dux that basically takes everything that came from that and that listener. It's not called a listener, but it's listening basically. All of these sagas are listening. So category search item added, it wasn't able to call the search categories afterwards because it failed. So it will kind of roll that back. You don't have to have a chain of reaction of, okay, well now, you know exactly where that is. So.
Well, and it would be fair to also point out that our sagas in their current form and branded components, where we're using them, are probably too light in what they do, because we should be putting try-catch statements inside of our worker sagas. Like we shouldn't see that happen where you look at the console and you see, oh, the entire thing got booked because I didn't catch that error.
Right.
So the positive thing is that when there are errors that happen from asynchronous calls, you know exactly where to find them, because they're always going to be in your worker sagas. But the downside is that you want to make sure to expect certain types of errors and funnel them appropriately. But the other thing that's nice and is very scalable is that in your catch statement you can invoke put. Again, put just takes whatever shaped action that you have and throws it back into the main thread. And so if in your main Redux store, say for example, you had a little section of your Redux store that handled just error messages that maybe was wired into like some header at the top of the page that always showed error messages to the user. Inside of your try-catch statement, your worker saga, you could invoke put, and will then throw it back into the main thread where the reducer that handles errors will pick it up and then format it appropriately. But additionally, in your catch statement, you could also fire off another asynchronous call to then go to an external logging service where we're collecting that data. We just haven't really matured our front-end error handling strategies yet. So that's the main thing I would think that would probably change with the worker sagas is at least the worker sagas themselves make it a little bit bigger, because they need to have predictable expected behavior for what happens when there are errors or even just 401s.
Definitely want to catch those errors.
One other thing that's part of the Redux implementation that they haven't made their way into any of the components yet, but it was actually part of why I wanted to fork from Extensible Dux was middle of last year started to hear more buzz in the React Redux community about state machines and being able to better predict when your application gets into some weird state. And not just in the general term of just state management, like when we're talking about a Redux store, like how do you actually deal with shaped pieces of the Redux store, not that kind of state management, but just instead, like whether or not your application has made its way into a weird state that you can't figure out how it got there. And one of the ways that people are trying to solve that is with finite state machines and just trying to find the best way to blend that into the Redux flow of things. And the implementation that I put into Redux is kind of based on something I saw with Redux Machine, where all that Redux Machine is doing is it's taking your reducer and and after the reducer function gets invoked, it's putting this field onto the store called status that is then updating it if it's in a state where it can transition. And so what you can do is you can take that field status and you can inject it into your components so that basically if that field has changed, then you can advance some behavior in your front end. So you can create many different types of state machines, basically. So if, for example, you knew that you have a terms of agreement functionality for your application, and you wanted to make sure that the user does not actually end up in any spot in our site if they haven't agreed to the terms of service, but you could see some weird thing happen where somebody's not crossing all their T's or dotting all their I's on the front end, and somehow the person has managed to cancel out of terms of agreement, but still end up in a page they're not supposed to be at. So if you created a state machine instead that basically indicated, all right, I have an initial state, and then I have either agree to terms or reject terms. And if they put rejected terms, and that pushes it into an unrecoverable state of like where you can't advance. But if they hit agree, then it puts them into an agree to terms state so that they will permanently be in that one. So you can create these different types of tiny little state machines that will indicate whether or not the person can even get into a certain type of state, and you can drive your logic on the front end much better off of those types of predictable control state sheets by doing that.
It seems like it'd be similar to what you do with authentication. You also could do it that way as well.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah.
So one of the things I've been wanting to do on the back end, which I think we should do on the front end as well, I don't know how everybody else learns. I don't learn big, broad theories and concepts all at once. Like that's not how I learn personally. I don't think I'm too unique. I think there's other people like that. But basically, I learn through mimicry first, and then when I run into an issue, I solve the problem. Then I go and care about the theory. What would be really helpful, and I need to do it on the back end as well. For like, if you want a REST API, step one, create a data model. Step two, create a RPC thing. Here's how, show how to use create the RPC methods from those. Literally, without a lot of detailed theory and reasoning behind it, literally do these things so you can see something on the screen as fast as possible. The understanding, for me anyway, comes much further after that because you're motivated when you can get something on the screen as fast as possible. When you can get the result. The result matters more first, and then the understanding comes later.
It's the practical versus the theoretical first. Like
Yeah, because it doesn't. People can throw information at you all day long, and that's why I didn't like university. It's computer science, to be honest. Sitting in a classroom with some dude lecturing me in front of big old notation and stuff.
here's what queuing theory is.
Yeah, I don't care. Like it doesn't matter to me because it doesn't impact me and the things I want to get done. I do care about those things. It's just I don't get to them by caring about them
It
first.
feels like you don't know the context.
Yeah.
You have nothing to.
Yeah, I have nothing to. It's the same with math. We teach math too. It's the same idea, right?
Yeah.
And so I need to do it on the back end as well, and I think we should really do that. Not just for me, but I can't believe I'm the only. When somebody starts on day one and they want to contribute before they have to sit and read all the source code and their stack to remotely know what's going on, they should be able to create an API from the documentation I created tutorial-wise, and then I'll take that and then put something on the screen. You should be able to take those and do that full flow without
Literally,
really
it's kind of like a little tutorial where it's like, okay, run the app kit. Okay, now we're going to add.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Because even having that would have certainly helped me. Even I probably could have gotten great organizations. Yes. Without not really, I wouldn't have fully grasped it yet, but I could have at least probably had something that we could have done fine from.
Yeah, if I had more time, I would.
I know we don't. I know,
Yeah,
That's
that's what I
create
wanted
that
to do,
like-
is actually, I wanted to walk through creating an example, but the APIs that I was relying on weren't exactly in the right state that I need them to be, so that.
Yeah, and I don't know where to, I think we should have that. Oh, God, okay.
Yeah.
I hate conflicts, because that's where things go to die. but-
See, I mean, maybe
Nobody searches the wiki.
I know, I do.
That's the way to say fuck you to somebody.
Yes, yeah,
Nowadays,
that's-
it's like, is it in conflict?
Check the wiki.
That's the way
You're
to
telling me
say
to go fuck myself.
I'm gonna cry now.
That's the
Yeah.
line.
I've been working for weeks on Wiki.
I always guys were recording.
Oh,
But,
edit
so,
that part out, we have tools for
that's okay.
that. To the wiki.
So, I mean, maybe for better or for worse, I was trying to go step by step. The way that I do it is I go from routes to the container to the component, and well, hopefully I've just got like a div with some, just something that I can use in there. Nothing crazy. We can style it at a different place. And then I go and look at the ducks so I can create the initial state, create the action, create the, two actions. In this flow, we don't have to use this flow, but in our current application, we're just using okay, go get the thing, now I got the thing. Reducer, so that I can parse out what's going on in the reducer. If there's not an API call yet, I make that API call inside of API.js, and they all kind of work together. So I was trying to go in that step-by-step flow. It might not be the way that David even does it, and because he was saying that he would start with the Redux store and how you define the data first. But just for getting something on the page, that's
What would you be? Literally starting with the API call and being able to just invoke that, even if I have to do it from the console, JavaScript console, call that.
Yeah,
Call that function.
Get the data in. Okay, now how do I want to put it into the store? How do I?
yeah,
get it
that's
into
the
store?
revert. So people think differently. You could start that from that end and go work your way back up through all the way through the API to the Saga to the container. Oh, sorry, the ducks, then to the container,
those functions in the RESTful.js or API.js are, I know we're in a little bit of state of. So, wait, no, I guess it is API.js.
Yeah, it's API.
Yeah.
So if I wanted to, like, if I wrote that constant, can I call that? I can't, it's not function.
What
Or it is.
was this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I could just call, okay, that's not that big a deal, never mind.
Yeah.
Because I can just call that directory. Okay.
I mean, my typical thing that,
Yeah,
that I've started with, like, the past 2 years, just like implementing a new React feature is I usually always go into the initial state.js and just carve out any difference in like the way that the Redux store is going to look based on that, and then I jump into the container component to actually start doing a map state to props, and then I go into the component and start trying to put the initial pieces of those new props in there. And then afterwards, I realized, oh yeah, I forgot to create an action type, and I forgot to create an action operator, and I forgot to like try to figure out like the best way of like wrapping this batch action. So I think that's kind of one of the reasons why there's been those suggestions to kind of modularize all the Redux boilerplate. It's just like it's just one of those things where, especially before we had like hot module reloading, where like the entire thing would unhook and you have to start again. And you just have to like every single time remember like, okay, before I can actually fire this up, I actually have to make sure the type exists, and I have to make sure the action creator exists, and I have to make sure that the reducer is not referring to a type that doesn't exist yet. That stuff is just like
one of the things that
Redux.
This is old curmudgeon me. One of the things I do miss though about this architecture, and if we can get there, that'd be awesome. Like what I really think we should do, ultimately what I would love to see is us be able to have a data model, literally show it on a page like as fast as possible. Because in the old MVC world, in the legacy world, you literally could create a data model and have information on a page within a matter of minutes.
Then you start crafting.
Within a matter of minutes. And then you start crafting around that. I don't know how we do that right now. Like I don't know how we get from creating a backend database thing and instantly have something on the screen, like within minutes. And how do we get there? And I don't think we're there yet or don't need to be. We lost that from the old legacy world. We lost that ability to quickly.
When we had template and crap.
Yeah, we literally just go from that to that. Why don't we, like, what can we do to get that back? Because it's really fast.
I want that back. I mean, personally, I think that.
Well, that's how you show it. That's how you get them to care.
That's not. I mean, we're talking about a little bit of a philosophical difference between like a front-end driven data needs versus like a database first, and then dragging that down to the front end, and that's.
But you can't say that's not. Sorry, that's literally what they're expressing. They're literally expressing that, so you can't say that's not how you get them to care. That's what they actually care. I mean, that's what they said.
We might just be referring to two different things here. I'm talking about like the way that I thought about data when I was primarily a backend developer versus being mainly a front-end first developer is different. And the way that I think about like getting my data onto the screen is more like, what's the way that I'm going to reason about this data most effectively with putting these front-end components together, and then I will shape the API calls based on the way that I think about it. And so that means that if I have to actually create this mapping layer between the way that the data really is on the database and the way that I'm reasoning about it on the front end, so be it. That's just how it's going to be. That changed, and so that's where some of this stuff might be a little bit different. Is you might be talking about like the way that the data looks and the way that you're modeling it as when you're creating the data models on the back end. But how do I get that visible on the front end? And I'm talking about I'm thinking about how to like shape and model that data from the way that product thinks about it. How do I shape that on the front end, and then how do I drive the shape of the API based on that? And so I don't think either one is entirely correct. I think they're just based on two different ways of starting with your application logic. One is more, database backend data modeling first. The other one is more how are these mock-ups shaped, and how is product and the end user thinking about it, and let me enforce the shape of the backend API based on
that. But if we can't show them that, then they have no point of reference to say, oh, we would rather do it this way. Right?
Well, as we talked about
the
other day, when I think Dave, you went for your therapy, you could still wire up all the sagas and then do like the really stupidest component in the world and just dump that JSON
Yeah.
from the Saga, and then from there, then that's where I think you can get into what David's talking about. Then you can start creating the UI per spec, and then yeah, you'll probably have to massage the back end.
I think you're gonna have to massage it a lot, but at that point, at least, like, now you have, I feel
But
like
you have something that
to
you
look at.
So you're at least going through all the components. You're hitting from the front end to the back end, getting data back and spitting it out on the web. It's ugly as shit. But at least there you got this process where you can start crafting the UI.
So what I here's what I used to
Before any of this, like, this is already done, we already explained, if somebody wants to view this, they can view it.
Oh, yeah.
I'm saying, like, we're already going way off kilter from a standpoint of, like, what the.
Thank you.
Point is.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to.
No, no.
Is this.
Hijack this again, damn it.
Yeah, go ahead. Like the recording at least, I mean, I don't wanna have like an hour-long file where it's only like 30 minutes of actual content.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it led to that because I'm trying to imagine how we can get back to that S feedback loop. That's all.